Hello, and welcome to this webinar, Enabling a Secure Digital Transformation for your ICS. Before we begin the presentation, I'd like to take a moment to familiarize you with this webinar environment. On your screen, you should see a media player, a Q&A window, the speakers' bios, which are shrunk at the moment, a resource list, which includes a collection of items related to today's topic, and a slide window, which is where you'll see most of our polls today. All of these windows can be resized or minimized to suit your viewing preferences. Simply point your mouse to the bottom right side of each window to resize a window, or use the minimize control on the upper right. At the bottom of your screen, there's a collection of icons that give you added functionality. For example, you can share this presentation with colleagues on Twitter. Make sure to use the ICS Cybersecurity hashtag. You can also submit a request for an in-depth discussion with one of our local experts regarding the topic. And if you have questions regarding the subject matter of this presentation, feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A window at any time during the conference. We have reserved some time at the end of the presentation to address them. For those viewing the recorded version of this presentation, we have configured the environment to have your questions sent directly to our presenter through an email follow-up. With that, we'll begin our presentation. Allow me to introduce our moderator today, Mike Lester. Mike is a Director of Cybersecurity Strategy, Governance, and Architecture at Emerson Automation Solutions. He oversees the global development and implementation of cybersecurity solutions in the company's products and services. He works with a variety of engineering and development organizations and teams and develops our secure architectures and designs.
Thank you, Amelia. Hello, everyone. It's good to be here. Introduce the next two speakers who will give their perspective on this important topic. Peter Zornio is the Chief Technology Officer for Emerson Automation Solutions and has responsibility for overall coordination of technology programs, product, and portfolio direction across the Automation Solutions platform. This includes Emerson's digitalization and industrial Internet of Things development, such as the plant web digital ecosystem.
Hi, Robert Lee is joining you today.
Thanks, Peter. Robert Lee is the CEO of Dragos and recognized pioneer in the industrial security incident response and threat intelligence community. He gained his start in security as a U.S. Air Force Cyber Warfare Operations Officer, passed to the National Security Agency, where he built the first of its kind mission to identify and analyze national threats to industrial infrastructure. We're fortunate to have both of you here today, so provide. Did you want to say hi, Robert? So it's good for both of you to be here today. Provide a great lens to our conversation. Peter, you can offer us a lot of insight with your understanding of how to apply technology across multiple industries and guide our products and solutions to meet industry needs. While Robert, your work within industry to secure plants and critical manufacturing will provide additional insight from a cybersecurity perspective. So to get started, digital transformation can mean so many things to different people. So let's start today by defining how we're using it, how we're using digital transformation in this conversation. It refers to the use of technologies, data, and processes to securely enhance capabilities toward decision support, increasing overall business performance, and cultural change within a company. We might also hear references such as Industrial Internet of Things, Industry 4.0, or even Internet of Things, which also fall under the digital transformation umbrella. Organizations are seeing experience walk out the door and are depending more and more on service-oriented business models that do things to get data from operational assets and processes. And what's different about these conversations is the potential for increased cyber risk as new systems, devices, and architectures are implemented with hyperconnectivity. In addition, we've seen COVID-19 drive everyone working remotely in a short period of time and forcing some transformational efforts outside of traditional approaches. To add to this, there's been a general increase in threat landscape across critical manufacturing industries, and even more so in the last year, such as the increased activity with pharmaceutical companies during COVID-19. So kind of steering this back to the point of our conversation today, an effective digital transformation program uses technology to protect both people and essential industries without compromising security. A key point in digital transformation is that it can be done wrong, but let's talk about how to do it right and protect your systems and operations. As I go to Peter and Robert, I'd like to ask our audience to take a quick poll. The question you're going to see on your screen is, what real or perceived barriers do you have for digital transformation? So as you're responding to that, I'm going to go to Peter. Let me start with you and get the conversation rolling. What are you seeing as security concerns or challenges in digital transformation that our customers are facing?
Hi, Mike. Well, I think as you alluded to, there's pretty much everything you look at in the world of digital transformation involves in one way or another access to what we call operational technology or OT data, a lot of data that largely is in the industrial control systems of all these manufacturers. Now, in the past, there would be ways to pull this data out in very well-defined paths, to feed business systems. And, there was architectural constructs such as a demilitarized zone and layers of security and the famed Purdue model. But now what we see with digital transformation, everybody wants access to all the data all the time is what it feels like. So all the OT data is now fair game for people in IT who want to bring it into the cloud and run cloud-based analytics on it. You want to send it to third-party suppliers so that they can decide how to do things with you. You have the population inside the plant itself that's looking at trying to get the data more. So to me, one of the biggest cybersecurity concerns that's come up as we look at digital transformation is just the sheer number of people and uses and demand on getting that OT data and getting it out to everybody. When you have architectures and a lot of constructs that were really not built around everyone getting the data, they were really built around very specific small paths for feeding specific applications. So I think everyone we talk to is dealing with that challenge. And they're dealing also with how they get all the different types of data that they want to get, because it's not always easy to pull out, the accompanying metadata and some of the reliability data and other things that people would like to have for their digital transformation. So it's also a big fact that when you look at the cybersecurity concerns of OT data, unlike other areas like IT, where you're mostly concerned about what people might be pulling out, in the OT world, you're worried about what might be coming in. You're worried about something that you set up as an exit ramp for data to a third party or an IT organization becomes an indoor for bad actors downloading what you don't want to have. And that's generally the biggest threat that people are concerned about in the OT world. So you have that other aspect here where it's not just people getting data they shouldn't have. The bigger concern is what might be coming in. So that's, to me, the big issue.
Thanks, Peter. Robert, I'm pretty sure you have a perspective on this too, right?
Yeah, and so I think this is good. So, as he alluded to, the architectures and the discussions we've had around security, whether it be IT or OT, has really prioritized a prevention-based strategy over the years. Hey, let's architect it correctly. Let's put firewalls into place, DMZs, whatever else. It's all about keeping people from accessing things they shouldn't have been accessing. And before we even get to kind of the digital transformation story and the differences in IT and OT, we find that even in the enterprise security world, that concept of prevent everything and we'll be okay failed a long time ago. And we see that time and time again, where organizations have to instead assume a breach, assume that they're compromised, and how are we going to find it, knowing that prevention at some point fails. Not saying don't do prevention, but broader information security had drastically undervalued detection and response. And getting prevention, detection, and response kind of all together was a really important part of the journey. Sort of take that to OT in the discussion we're having with digital transformation, and the idea that you were going to have a heavily prevention-based strategy definitely went out the door on the whole concept of connect everything. And of course, that's not always what's happening, but to many, digital transformation actually represents hyperconnectivity. So once you have that hyperconnectivity, bad actors coming in as an example, it's really important then to be able to understand what's actually going in and what's actually going on inside these environments and making sure we know how to respond to them correctly. I'll sort of bridge it on why is this different between OT and IT. The discussion really relates to the fact that at the end of the day, we have a mission purpose. There's a different mission in OT than you might find in typical enterprise environments. That's not to put down enterprise security. It's not to say that IT is not on the same level. We keep all that versus crap away, and we see that sometimes in the community, IT versus OT. Just put that to the side for a second. The reality is the need to understand what is the mission of the plant, what is the mission of that facility, what are we trying to accomplish is hyper critical to ever solving anything in security. Further, the threats that we're seeing to OT environments are different. We see different actors and teams going after OT than we do IT. We see that the methods and the behaviors and the tradecraft, or the MO, if you will, that these actors are performing is different than what we're seeing in IT. And a lot of the controls that you would have in enterprise and IT security don't give you the same value in OT. A great example is vulnerabilities. You'll find a lot of enterprise security cares very heavily about vulnerabilities in software and products. A lot of them give access to adversaries or additional mechanisms for the adversary to do something on that system. Go over to the OT world and you'll find that the vulnerability oftentimes isn't the point. Now, I'm not saying don't patch your equipment. That's not the argument. But what I will say is that what we find adversaries doing on the OT side of the house instead is understanding the system, understanding the system of systems aspect of those environments, and being able to take advantage of native functionality. If I can open the circuit breaker, I can close the circuit breaker. I don't need a vulnerability or exploit to accomplish that. It's system resident behaviors. It's native functionality. So in concluding, I will say, or sort of wrapping up for this section, I'll say that the idea is really understand prevention, detection, and response. And when we're looking at OT in general, the nature of the systems, the nature of the mission, the focus of the difference in the threats and the things that they're going to do is ultimately going to drive a different people, process, technology answer into how we address that risk.
That's right. So, I mean, kind of going back to that, cloud's a way of business, and cloud businesses can achieve significant technology advances in shorter periods of time, provide more efficient operations, and lowering the overall investments and depreciation on the balance sheet. So, I mean, these subscription model services aren't, they're opening new doors and technologies from a technology perspective, but are enabling organizations adopt them more effectively at a lower price point. So with all of that said, and as you go through the full stack with the hyperconnectivity in mind, Peter, what are your thoughts around, with full digital transformation, achieving the right business objectives and making sure that we remain secure through the whole process?
Well, for sure it can be done. I mean, it's not something that is an acceptable barrier to say, hey, the cybersecurity risk is too high, we're just not going to do it. You just have to make sure you're careful and focusing on the right areas, and that you actually are making conscious decision and architecting good solutions. So to highlight sort of one of the differences that, I think both Rob and I talked about, the fact that you're worried about securely exporting the data, we came up with a term, as you know, Mike, at Emerson. Everybody in the internet's familiar with, the last mile, right? How do we get the data downloaded to us? And that was the big internet term. We came up with this term, secure first mile, meaning how do you securely export the data from where the data is being generated inside the OT world to wherever it might be going. And we've developed a number of different blueprint architecture for how that can be done, ranging from maybe some of the most extremes where people are setting up an entirely separate pathway for that data to come out, through a cellular network and making sure that those sensors are actually unique sensors that don't even interact with some of the other control OT systems, to things that are maybe more traditionally architected in terms of using cloud connections, secure connections from one company's cloud to another company's cloud, or actually having, in some cases, allowing secure pathways in that we've architected with that particular customer. But it can be done. It just needs to be done carefully. And I think the biggest thing that people have to watch out for is traditionally when we go in and we look at a customer, we find there's a lot of connections that are coming in from vendors or from other that many times people don't even know, right? That were installed at the time of startup or when people first got going, it was convenient. A guy that had a piece of equipment on a skid was going to troubleshoot that equipment. They set up a dial-in and nobody ever turned it off. So, one of the most important things is to start with just doing an audit, right? Just really seeing what you've got and what you don't have so that you can go put in efforts where they're going to deliver the most results.
Yeah, I know. I'll tell you, with digital transformation, even with just digital work processes like you mentioned, and not even now with COVID, I get pulled into a lot of customer conversations about remote access, and really believe that the business leaders should be asking questions about these details, about how are third parties accessing their systems and data, what data is being extracted, and what type of secure mobility options are there. Robert, from your perspective, what are your thoughts on this, and have you been seeing this as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's extremely common, especially as Peter mentioned on the business side, to say we are doing digital transformation. Like, it's important to our business. This is a fundamental component of the direction we're heading. How do we do this? And no, we're not going to because there's risk is not an acceptable answer. It's how do we actually measure and sort of maintain discussions on how we're going to minimize that risk. What I'll kind of highlight there, though, which I think is really important, is cybersecurity really can transform from we're the barrier, we're the hindrance kind of thought process to we're the enabler. You want to go do this digital transformation. You don't have the foundation right now as a company to take advantage of it. So here's the plan. Here's how we're going to actually get you there. And I think especially when we see cultures done correctly between kind of the IT and OT side of the house, it's that they engage as partners. They come up with the actual problem statement. What is the requirement? And they go off and they tackle it together. And I have many companies we work with where there is no difference between engineering and security and everybody else. They're just all on the same page and it works wonderfully. When we find that there's big differences between them or barriers, sometimes it's at the strategic level of the company setting different requirements in the different groups that actually don't leverage out very well. But sometimes, and not to put my security brothers and sisters down, but a lot of it is, hey, this standard or this framework or this regulation, this is what you got to do. And it's like plop it over to the engineer or the operator side of the house and go, do all these things, this is the standard. When it's entirely backwards. It's almost, in many ways, kind of like the safety culture, where you go in and you actually think of what are your requirements, what are the scenarios we're trying to plan for, like the PHA as an example, and you think through start to finish what is the scenario. I recommend the security side of the house do the exact same thing. Hey, we're going to connect up in cloud. Okay, we're going to connect up in digital transformation kind of discussions. Okay, what are the scenarios we're concerned with? What are the actual drivers? Is it an insider threat scenario? Is it a state adversary? Well, what are those scenarios looking like? And let's go through and think of compensating controls across the whole value chain there. Let's not pretend that any one control is going to be the winner. And let's actually then map it back to standards and framework of an approach to it. And you're really going to allow the creativity of both teams, if you will, to come out and usually partner a lot better. What we ultimately find most companies do is they'll usually start with something like an incident response tabletop exercise that'll oftentimes include the executives or at least the plant management staff of here's what bad could look like at our facility. Here is exactly the kind of thing we're thinking about. And then let that drive okay, well, we need this technology, we need this process, we need this training for our people. What does the full solution look like towards that? And I don't think that the digital transformation story makes everything night and day different. I think it just exacerbates the discussion of this is what we should have been thinking about anyways, and now we're forced to realize we have to have this conversation. So how can we have that conversation?
Yeah, I'd like to add, Rob, you talked about, you never talk about IIoT competition per se. We also stopped talking about IIoT convergence because that implies sort of one group's going to be taken over by the other and they don't like, so I always like to say IIoT collaboration. Is what we're heading.
Yeah, and the convergence happen like
the same mission.
Yeah, exactly. And I always think it's funny. I'll see some conference presentation like, let me tell you about the IIoT convergence. Like, dude, that happened like 15 years ago. There's windows in the plant. Like, that's not the problem. It's the culture convergence and the convergence of, and really when I talk more at like the board level, I'll highlight the question, which is why now? And I think this is fair. And many in our audience may feel the same way of like, why now? What's the big driver now? What's changed? And the thing I like to highlight is, well, you have the threat landscape and the insights we have, which prior we didn't have a lot of visibility into it, probably because we weren't looking as well. But now we've got a lot of visibility into a number of different state actors targeting lots of different facilities, not just a one-off, and we know what they're doing. And we have the landscape change of kind of that hyper connectivity. it's the convergence of those two things that are driving a lot of the discussions we're seeing now on increased risk and increased connectivity. How are we going to deal with this?
So I think, this will probably be a good time to drop in another question or poll question for our audience. Does your company have an investment strategy for digital transformation? Which, what I'm hearing in the conversation, should also include that cybersecurity foundational element of assessing and getting an understanding of what's actually there, and then working to build out your compensating controls and secure architecture to achieve the business objectives of digital transformation, whether it be small or large. So as you're looking at that question, so I know, Robert, I'll go to you for this. There's been a lot of work recently. You talked a little bit about standards, and while most of us security practitioners, we will lean on standards because they give us a good baseline and a good framework to operate within. There's been a lot of work done from the perspective of best practices within the industry. Can you highlight some of the any recent cases and share learnings that our participants can take away from them? Thinking about the MITRE attack matrix and those types of things.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good one. So broader cybersecurity discussion, over the years, we've taken a very, I would say, point kind of answer of, can you find this IP address? Can you find this digital hash related to malicious software? There's a very atomic indicator relation of what a lot of security teams are doing over the years. And I want to say about a decade ago, the NSA really kind of pushed people more towards, you're not going to detect us that way, so you're not going to detect the adversaries. You need to start thinking a little bit bigger. You need to start thinking about the behavior of adversaries instead of just technical indicators. Not saying technical indicators are bad, but how do we start thinking about how are the adversaries behaving, and can we detect classes of behaviors? And that spawned the MITRE attack framework for the industry, which was really as an open source kind of framework that MITRE put together with a lot of insights from the NSA, but then contributed to by a number of companies out in the community to say, not the millions and billions of technical indicators we have to track, but what are the top 5? What are the overall 50 or 100 different tactics or methods that an adversary can do? And do we have coverage against them, yes or no? Would we be okay? So that was kind of the direction that moved. And this past couple years, they started working on one for ICS. Now, the problem at the beginning was there wasn't a lot of insights into what the ICS threats were doing. And the MITRE attack framework is only built off of what is public information. It can't just be classified or sensitive sources. It has to be public. So my firm ended up releasing a lot of information. We track 13 different state groups today that are targeting industrial environments. And we helped MITRE, and we sort of collaborated with them and helped build this out for the community. And it shows 81 different tactics today. It'll grow over time, of course, but 81 different tactics today that adversaries take advantage of to disable alarming or modify safety controllers or manipulate a digital relay in a power environment. These types of different things you can do. And again, kind of what we're pushing folks to do is not just, can I get visibility on my environment? I think that's a big conversation these days, and that's great. But not only can I get visibility, but can I understand that when something bad or risky happens, I have the context of what it is and why I care. I don't want to just get a bunch of alarms, because that's the direction the security community went early on. It's the direction engineering and operations community knows very well of alarm fatigue. It's how do we get in a direction of actually knowing the right actionable kind of information. So MITRE attack for ICS is one to look at of kind of what the industry is doing. And then we're also seeing a lot of, I would say, learnings off of the frameworks like 62443, NERC-CIP in the power community, et cetera, where standards and frameworks were really built 2015 and prior. And a lot of our insights into the threats and what they're actually doing, the ground truth reality of it, is 2015 to now. And so what we've kind of identified as a community is the standards and frameworks are good. They're a nice base of practice, but there is a lag between what the threats are doing today and what the standards and frameworks are putting in place. And that's really where there's an encouraging aspect to the community of go get proactive for that. Go talk to the Emersons and Dragos of the world. Go figure out what is actually happening outside your borders. What is that lag? And let's come up with understanding of controls and things that we should be doing. But I'll go back and sort of end it on the highlight of, at the end of the day, it's really around what are a couple of those scenarios you want to get through. If you can't think through one or two that you could do, don't worry about the 81. It's think of the top couple risk scenarios to start with, and then you kind of start building your program from there instead of trying to boil the ocean.
Yeah, I think the visibility also of what is going on and what is happening out there in terms of potential threats and what people have suffered as consequences with some of the famous attacks that might have happened at like Aramco or at Merck. One of the side benefits, if you will, of that is driven is, Mike's familiar. I use this analogy a lot. You don't have to convince people that they need car insurance. Why? Because they see car accidents happen. They know somebody who was in a car accident. They know somebody who was injured by a car accident. They know there's crazy drivers. Okay, so they know, yeah, this could happen to me. I think for a period of time when we didn't have a lot of public incidents and a lot of knowledge of how big and expansive the threat envelope really was, we had a lot of people who said, like, why do I need to take cybersecurity seriously in my plant? I don't know anybody who's been hacked. I haven't seen any damage that's occurred to anybody. That doesn't happen anymore. Now people, as I like to say, they've seen car accidents. They know it could happen to them, and they know that they need to spend the money, take the concerns to make cybersecurity truly a part of their culture. And it's tough because from a business perspective, you can look at it and think, well, this doesn't make another pound of product, right? Or generate another, watt hour of electricity. But the consequences, just like a car accident, you don't need your insurance until you actually, have one. The fact that that can happen and that it's really all about prevention has driven a lot of people to take it a lot more seriously, I think, over the years than we would have seen like even 5 years ago.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really good point where even as a cybersecurity vendor in this space, we had to balance it where I don't want to hype people up and I don't want to come screaming to the hills because we've had too much of that in the community. And usually I'm out in the front going, calm it down. A phishing email does not take down a power grid. Yeah. A VPN access does not compromise safety. Like, calm it down. But at the same time, we are seeing a lot of those threats, and they are doing things like the Saudi Arabian oil case in 2017, where an adversary explicitly tried to kill people by compromising safety systems at that site. I mean, these are very serious discussions. And so, we found it to be even a difficult discussion to have publicly, where even if we just say, here's a case we worked, the ability for media to very quickly pick it up and spin it is concerning. And what I often tell people is the threats are worse than you realize, but not as bad as you want to imagine. It's not the diehard 4 fire sale crap, but at the same time, it's not onesies and twosies. We're a technology vendor, but we have an incident response and kind of intel team, and our incident response team is constantly busy, and that's not great. And they're not just like, a random piece of malware got in the facility. I mean, they're targeted cases across every single continent. I mean, it is entirely insane that every time we start looking more, we find more. And that's kind of a central message for a lot of people is you may not think, we've never been attacked. Well, are you monitoring? Are you looking? Well, no. Then, how would you know? Like, you go look, go hunt. I'm confident you will start to find some things.
Yeah, and the days are long gone when it was just the ICS was not the intended target, but was the victim of something that came through the business network that was really a general Windows kind of virus or thing that was put out there. Those are kind of like the good old days now, right? Versus the targeted ICS type of attacks that we see all the time.
I mean, this is a great point that Mike had in the beginning around with the pharmaceutical targeting that we saw. So I got pulled into a lot of the White House level discussions around Operation Warp Speed and kind of what we're doing from a COVID vaccine perspective across the United States. And the conversation wasn't around they're going to compromise their business email systems or whatever. It's going to be these specific systems, and we'll keep it off here, but these specific systems, because that's where the vaccine research development's done. And then we're concerned about these manufacturing systems where you could modify the recipe or modify the ingredients or modify something that would cause a safety impact. And when we were like, nobody would do that. And immediately you start looking, you're like, holy crap, they're trying to do that. And I think even for me, where I don't, I've seen enough adversaries have been involved in enough cases that I don't try to pretend I know the adversary. So it's not, they would or wouldn't do this. You don't want to make those assumptions. But even for me, it was hard thinking, surely no one would explicitly be trying to hurt people at a moment in time with a global pandemic. And you start looking, you're like, wow, yeah, the world is absolutely full of some evil people. And so yeah, it's more and more explicitly ICS targeting. And even when we see campaigns of adversaries hitting the enterprise nowadays, you'll see theming towards CVs of engineers and operators. You'll see compromising of software updates explicitly meant for the ICS environment. So you're right, it's absolutely targeted there. And as these companies do the digital transformation kind of journey, the value of those data sets competitively between countries is significant, and we will only see those threats rise.
Robert, I appreciate that you're not arm waving and creating FUD, and you like to tamp that down out of the industry. I think that's really important for people to know. But in reality too, there's a significant risk here, to some of the newer things and newer technologies if people don't know how to operate them or configure them well, or and talking about you put things into place in a digital transformation that needs feeding and watering and carrying in perpetuity. You can't just set it and forget it. I think those days are kind of gone. But the kind of coming back to we're seeing experience walk out the door. We're also seeing new technologies injected into new solutions and new ways to get the data. What are some of the tactics for building a business case to whether it's a small digital transformation or whether it's a larger project, to make sure that the right cybersecurity components are built into that and really helping justify the business case toward those business objectives, because sometimes the barrier can also be cost, as well as a lack of understanding from a cybersecurity or risk perspective.
Yeah, and I'll say I spend a lot of time at the board level these days having these exact conversations, which is to say that a lot of the security metrics I see come up to boards, as an example, are like, here's how many scans we saw or how many attacks we saw and all that. And you gotta get past that. It's not telling your story. They're not useful metrics. Like, table all that stuff. It's eye candy for eye candy's purpose, and the board's not stupid. What we need to be getting into a habit of, which I kind of talked about earlier, was more of scenario discussions of what is the risk start to finish. It's not just the modification of a safety system. It's the compromise in the VPN vendor that then leads the engineer workstation that then compromises, the safety control. It's the whole chain. What is that chain? What do we think about it? Don't try to pretend you can understand frequency. It's binary. Do we want to accept this risk or do we want to mitigate this risk? One or the other. And then again, it's that what is the whole story and what would it take to do prevention, detection, and response? And what would right look like? Then to lay that against your organization. And what I often tell people is to get in kind of an A, B, and C mindset. You can think of it high, medium, low. It doesn't matter. But A and C is pretty straightforward. Most critical sites. There are many manufacturers that can pick out the 10% of their sites that if they lost, their business is gone. And they can pick the 20% that they can be down for a month and it really wouldn't impact anything. It's bad. You don't want it to happen, but they'd be okay. So from a risk perspective, it's what are my A-class sites? What are my B-class sites? What are my C-class sites? And my A-class sites, I want to have prevention, detection, response against the top 5 or 6 scenarios that I can think about and be ready for. Maybe it's the top 3 at my B-class sites. And maybe at my C-class sites and across the board, it's a segmentation and an instant response strategy. Maybe it's just 1 or 2 controls. And I think that's kind of exciting as well on the operations side, where you look at the enterprise, there's a ton of security controls and products and training and this and that and the other. And if you think you have to copy and paste all that, you're going to be put off. But the reality is you don't. The reality is IT security went through the 30 years of learning to get to where they were, and we can steal a lot of the things that work and forget a lot of the things that don't. And when you're looking at the operations side of the house, 4, 5, maybe 6 controls can put you in a really good place if you've actually tied them together. But if you're getting asset identification and visibility and it's divorced from your response plan, I don't care what product or process you chose, it's never going to connect up, definitely not in the instant. And so piecing together the full story and kind of the strategy behind it is definitely the route to go, in my opinion. So
what Rob just described is basically what everybody who is in a more hazardous processing kind of process environment does for safety. And one of the things that we like to stress a lot to our customers is your cybersecurity practices can be and should be very much the same as your safety practices. So what happens when somebody does a safety analysis on a plant? They go in and they do what's called a HAZOps, if you're familiar with that, hazardous operations. They go through what are the scenarios that could occur if this pressure relief valve were not to open correctly or this valve was left in the wrong position. They go through all of that, and they look at LOPA, layers of protection. They look at how many layers of protection are in place to keep that from occurring. And then you make a judgment call based on likelihood of occurrence, consequence of failure, right? So, how likely is this sort of chain of events that we just described to occur, and how bad would the consequence would be? And that's how you make intelligent, informed decisions about how much you're going to put in to mitigate that risk. And that's a process that's well known in the process industries. All of our customers in the refining, petrochemical, chemical business like that have gone through the HAZOP kind of process. It's really the exact same sort of process that they should be and could be following for cybersecurity, very much as Rob just described. And so it doesn't have to be something that's new and foreign. You can take something that you already have, the safety practice, and just use that same sort of principle and that exact process on evaluating what your cybersecurity risk is and what kind of actions you should be taking.
Absolutely. And I think with like the layers of protection aspect, you could deploy 5 layers of protection. If they're not actually working together on the same scenarios, it doesn't matter. And it's the exact same thing. If you can go buy a bunch of blinky boxes or go put people in training or do a bunch of processes around cybersecurity, but if it's not connected together of an overall strategy of what you're trying to reduce the risk against, it's not going to work together at all.
I was just going to add to that. I think it's to what both of you are saying. Going through a digital transformation, making sure that you have the right strategy for cybersecurity as you approach it. And back to Peter's point about treating this just like safety from a HAZOPS perspective. One of the first questions I always ask as a cybersecurity practitioner is, why do you want to connect and why do we need to connect, right? So putting things in context and really partnering with the operators to make sure that we have a good understanding of what the business objectives are, going back to Peter's point, what data is really needed, and what are you trying to achieve with that, building in the cybersecurity controls, or whether it's layer upon layer, or whether, how that's done through the architecture, is a really important approach to remember as well as we go forward with this. Any comments on, what you've seen, Peter, from a data type and from a digital transformation perspective?
Yeah. So, Mike, I would make a comment on what you just said, which is, I think increasingly what we find is that was what people used to do is they would have an application or something they wanted to do. They'd identify the data sources they need. They'd come up with what they saw was a cyber secure way of getting that data out, whatever that architecture was. And then they'd come up with another use case for another set of data, and they'd come up with another way. And more what we see is people saying, look, we got too many people with digital transformation, I think, driving this. Too many people want too much data, that they're looking for more substantive, we only want to put, one hole through the firewall, right, kind of solutions for all the other applications that are on the other side, or all the other. They're looking for more sustainable ones that serve a greater number of people. And we spend a lot of time consulting with them on that. And frankly, inside our own portfolio of applications, we've had to work to consolidate, as you know, so that our own Emerson applications use consistent ways to pull data out of our systems instead of going to our customers and making them generate what we fondly, or maybe not so fondly, call Swiss cheese sometimes out of their firewalls or their security structures they put in place so they can support all those applications. So I see that also as kind of the big challenge now, is more uniform and sustainable architectures for securely pulling the data out that support lots of users and lots of applications versus the old, we'll fix this kind of one point case at a time. We have a lot of customers coming to us looking for that, and especially the IT guys, tend to want to drive that kind of an approach. It's exactly what Rob said earlier, but they like to say, well, these are the rules, and they would love it if you could say, these are the only mechanisms that are going to be used to pull out OT data. It's not always possible, but I do think that a lot of our customers are striving for more consistent ways to get the data out, regardless of what the end user is. Yeah,
and I would just add that it's definitely in a trust but verify state. there are not always your partners and integrators and OEMs that are, I would say, following the letter of the SLA or the letter of the law. And we've definitely found through a number of cases where making sure it's not only what is, again, that prevention type focus of trying to limit it down, but what are we actually seeing people do in our environments, and is that appropriate right now, and are they making changes when they should, and only taking the data they can access? We've had to work a number of cases which aren't just foreign states, but also figuring out, hey, that partner you thought wasn't as much of a trusted partner as you would have hoped. And there's been a lot of lessons learned that we've had, even on the ovation side, where the Dragos tech is the visibility monitoring piece of the Ovation power water security stack. And so as we get deployed in these environments, have these conversations with folks on their kind of digital transformation journey, one of the biggest lessons for me, one of the biggest things that's been cool to see is just the elevation of the topic. Where, and I don't, again, not trying to put any people down, but when you look at a number of board members around the room, not all of them are power, water, pharma kind of experts. Some of them are, sitting independent board members from the bank or whatever else. And for the security team, as well as the operations staff, to be able to say, here's what we're doing and why we're doing it, not only amplifies the sort of the necessity of the cybersecurity discussion, it amplifies we are an industrial company. Like, I like all the business stuff you're doing and all the data analytics piece you want to work on, but this is the reality of the physics behind the problem. And look at what we are in the business of doing, and let's think about the safety and understanding of that and not lose sight of that. And digital transformation kind of being the pulpit for both security and operations to come together and amplify that up to the board level, I think is a really powerful moment that I don't know that most companies are going to get a second time to really transform on the culture side as well.
That's really, really good insight, Robert. So from justifying digital transformation, Peter, to the board, what's your pro tip there? I mean, is it about the strategy? I mean, I've always seen that the devils are in the details are very complex. Boiling that up to the board level can be arduous for some.
Well, frankly, I very rarely have found myself in a position where you have to justify doing it. It's more working with boards or senior executives on what is it they actually think they're going to get out of it, and what are the business, there is so much hype right now, just to be blunt, around that, and it's a whole nother webinar we could do around analytics and, the vision and the dream of what they're actually going to learn by doing some of these new techniques and analytics, such as machine learning and AI on finding out the data. That it's more around, you quickly go to the how, not necessarily the why we need to do it. Because my personal experience has been that between the, IT companies, the IT consultants, the press, ourselves, frankly, as vendors, there's so much noise on this topic that's written to the board and executive level that they all believe, in most cases, that this is something they need to do and they need to, to save their business. Actually coming down to the brass tacks and what they're going to do and what the dollars are that are going to be returned and what activities are the highest priorities is what we actually spend most of our time working with those kinds of executives, because they've already believed they need to do it. Now they need to get some more tangible kind of results and programs in behind it is what I find.
Yeah, that's spot on. I think it's the brass tacks of it is always a bit funny to be in those conversations where, hey, we're going to go to this transformation. Okay, well, here's the bill of what it's going to take and the security component to do it. I'm like, well, maybe those plants don't need to go and do it. It's a quite interesting conversation when you put it all together. There are some companies who are really going to be winners on this, and the digital transformation story makes a lot of sense to them. I think what we're seeing in manufacturing, as an example, kind of the factories of the future, much more embracing of automation and kind of efficiencies, makes a lot of sense. But to your point, Peter, I've definitely been in those conversations where someone's predicting the $100 million cost savings or the $1 billion over the next couple of years. You do the math and you're like, no, man, you're not going to get there. Maybe 20% of it is still worthwhile doing, but let's really understand it, because there's a lot of folks that haven't been on the operations side of the house that are very smart mathematicians and similar with machine learning and discussions and everything else, but they may not understand, again, the physics of it and what you can and can't do in that environment.
Yeah, you can't change chemistry and physics still somehow, despite all of the analytics. Those rules seem to be immutable, and most of all of our customers deal with those two laws, chemistry and physics. So at the end, they can't change that part of what's happening in their
Yeah, what your adversaries have to deal with as well. When we think about the incident response side of the house and then thinking about detection and prevention strategy off of that, it is based in what is possible. And sometimes engineering out some of the cybersecurity concerns is a fantastic approach. You can't do it all that way. You can do some of it in a very meaningful way.
This has been a great conversation, and I hate to cut us off, but we have some questions from the audience, and I would like to try to get to those. Before I get there, though, I'm going to post our third final poll question as we survey, as well as a survey to tell us what you thought about today's discussion. So the poll question you're going to see come up on your screen is, have you had an assessment of your organizational cybersecurity capabilities relative to meeting digital transformation needs with both IT and OT functions at the table? And as you're answering those, I think it fits right along with one of the questions we have coming in from the audience. The question is, in IT and OT integration, who would drive the security aspects, considering IT portion being owned by customer and OT portion owned by automation vendor? Both can have different policies and requirements. Whoever wants to jump in first and talk to that.
I think so. Here's what we have seen. Okay. I think we have seen that the IT guys always have a role to play because the ICS systems always have a substantial component of IT hardware in them, whether it's, Windows-based operating systems and traditional switches and networking and stuff. And there's company policies and practices that can be taken from the IT world that are very applicable there. But when it comes to actually things like even simple stuff like patching policy or frequency of updates of applications, the OT guys have to be involved because the mission, as Rob said earlier, the mission is typically very different and the impact of causing a disturbance is very different, right? We always joke about, the message that comes down from IT, hey, the server's going down at 2 a.m., for maintenance, have a nice day, right? And everybody says, okay, that's fine. Who needs email at 2 a.m.? Okay. Well, guess what? That doesn't work for the OT systems. They need the OT systems at 2 a.m. because a lot of these facilities run 24/7, 365 if they can. So it has to be that collaboration between the two that we talked about earlier. Yes, the automation vendor is always going to have a say, and you should be listening to your automation vendor's recommendations on what a severity of a patch or an update is and evaluate whether it's really applicable to you and whether it needs to be put in place. But we've seen where, again, it needs to be a collaboration between both organizations. Rob, I'll ask you to comment.
Yeah, it's same kind of commentary. I think at the end of the day, the people who know what they're there for and the mission you're trying to solve is the operations side of the house. Security, and this is as a security professional, security is the digital janitor. Like, we are there to help clean up messes and we're there to help make it better, but we're not the mission. The mission is the operations side of the house. So I do think it has to be collaboration. I find myself arguing with either side in any given conversation I get into. Sometimes I walk in the ops side, well, we installed 2 firewalls, we're done. It's like, guys, stop. Like, you're not helping yourselves. And then sometimes I look at the IT side, like, we want to roll out antivirus and everything. Like, stop. What are you trying to do? And so I feel a little split personality of who I'm going to yelling at most that day. We both have our sides of the house to clean up, but when we do come together and actually understand what problem we're trying to solve, that collaboration is a very strong one. And I'll just say that, I've responded to more power outages due to the IT department than I have Russia, China, and Iran combined. You got to have a little bit of balance there for sure in what you're trying to accomplish. And I've seen the automation vendors and where we don't have as good a relationship as we do with like Emerson, where the automation vendor go, oh, you can't touch it, can't monitor it, can't touch it, can't do anything to it, validates the warranty, whatever. And it's like, whoa, that's not accurate either. And so there's a lot of conversations to be had. It's definitely a trust but verify discussion. But I would say at the end of the day, there's a ton you can do in those environments, and there's a ton you shouldn't do, whether you can or not. And so if we get down to what we're trying to accomplish, instead of just copy and pasting the IT security standards into the plant, we'll be in a much better place. Yeah,
and the guys I think that work the best are the ones that do the sometimes I call it, although it's inflammatory, the prisoner exchange, right? Where the IT guy comes in and works with the OT team for a while, or vice versa, and then they learn each other's mission, and then they realize, oh, that's why you're always complaining about this, or why you're always telling me to watch about this, right?
My favorite example of that is, and I hope it's okay to call out individuals, but my favorite example of that's Glenn Idell down at BSF. He was an IT guy 15 years ago. He had got adopted into the operations side of the house, been there for like 15 years. He is one of your better OT security practitioners around. He understands, things better than most people, and he can tell you what will and won't work in security. And that prisoner exchange works. And it is absolutely a good thing to look towards.
Prisoner exchange. That's a good. So let me go back to one of our poll questions here. So for what real or perceived barriers do you have for digital transformation? One of them, well, actually, two of the leading ones were cybersecurity, and no surprise, organizational silos, which is kind of what we're talking about here with IT and OT, right? And any further comments on those?
No, I mean, I actually have and it shouldn't be this way, but I've made this chart. I have an image in my mind a lot of times of, on one side is the digital transformation leader guy, and he's talking about all the stuff he's going to do, and he's going to grab all this data from OT, and he's going to share this data with suppliers, and they're going to speed up the supply chain, and they're going to have this close communication with customers, and all this stuff. And on the other side, I see the cybersecurity guy, the other guy just shaking his head like, no. So I even made a chart one time with those two guys as a tug of war, right, between the two sides. So the trick is, as I think both Rob and I have said, it's not an excuse not to do it. It's something you just got to be very aware of and make sure you're doing it correctly and consciously, but it's not an excuse not to go do digital transformation, although it's often one of the more used ones.
So so our last poll question, have you had an assessment of your organizational cybersecurity capabilities relative to meeting digital transformation with both IT and OT functions? So those came out 26% for both yes, and we have a security program for both functions. So that's pretty encouraging. For those 39% that answered no, Robert, do you have any recommendations on where to start for that as well?
I really do think it's the tabletop exercise, and this is even as a software vendor, right? My first thing is don't go buy product. My first thing is go do a tabletop exercise against one of those scenarios. If you're in the power sector, model out Ukraine 2016. If you're in a sector that has safety equipment, model out the Trisis attack in Saudi Arabia. But take one of these scenarios and actually run through it, not lasers from space and crap, just really what happened and what would it look like in your environment. Oh, well, we don't use that vendor, we use another one, therefore that wouldn't apply to us. Nope, the adversary is going to adapt to what would it look like in your environment and plot it out start to finish. In doing so, think through prevention, detection, and response, and what you're going to guarantee to find is the data you thought you would have during the incident you didn't have, the collection that was going to be required to detect it, you didn't have. The security team thought the plant personnel were going to be the points of contact, but they don't know what they're talking about from the IR perspective, or the plant folks thought IT was going to do a bunch of things they weren't trained on, and you're going to find a bunch of mismatches, and that's great. From there, you're going to be able to start building a roadmap. Don't get into these 5-year, 15-year, roadmaps that boil the ocean. Set out to do 3 or 4 important efforts across the next, 2-3 years, and you're going to put a real dent in the challenge, and you're going to learn things along the way. But it really does start with a tabletop exercise, in my opinion, of no kidding, what are we trying to solve? What would it look like here? Who are all the people around the room that need to be involved, and how can we brainstorm to fix this together?
Thanks, Robert. So we have another question here from the audience I want to take us to. And this is talking about a recent vulnerability. So it's 2 parts, one from Emerson perspective and one from a Dragos perspective. So Peter, you or I can team it, or I'll just let you take this from the Emerson perspective. One recent vulnerability impacting IT and OT is Ripple 20. Has Emerson had to deal with mitigating that for their products? That's the first part of the question. And the second part is, what recommendation does Dragos have for mitigating potential exposure while customers await patches from OEMs?
Yeah.
So Peter,
as as Mike knows very well, having had to coordinate all the, yes, we did have to respond. I mean, Ripple 20 hit a lot of different people's stuff. A lot of people were using the underlying software that came into play. So yes, we did have to issue some security notices around Ripple 20, and we have done so.
Yeah, and I'll say, and hopefully this doesn't come off course, so you guys correct me if I say anything too off kilt, but I don't think the OEMs writ large, all of them, were in the same place they are today as they were 15 years ago when they're making some of these choices. And we've definitely had a lot of insights that we're learning along the ways. Why I say that is one of the biggest problems with Ripple 20 and other vulnerabilities is that the software bill of goods or bill of materials, or like what's all in our products, is not really well known and articulated community-wide. Again, people are getting better at it these days, but your products that are in production for longer than probably 5 years ago, that wasn't the state of the union. So in my opinion, chasing down every vulnerability is not best practice. And again, I'm not trying to tell people not to patch. It's the same thing of like, oh, you should go change all your default passwords on your controllers. Why? There's hard-coded ones, there's vendor backdoor ones, there's like all these. Why are we focusing on a control that we know is not going to be that effective? If we do everything else, let's go do that. But when we were advising folks on Ripple 20, like we took a look at it, some of our researchers took a look at it, and it was way further than people realized, and the impact wasn't as bad as people were trying to make it out to be. And so what we told folks was monitor the behavior. Not, if you can find the equipment and they actually do issue a patch, great, go for it. But in our own research, we found that 64% of all ICS vulnerabilities were trash. They didn't do anything, no risk whatsoever, 64% of them. So if your patch policy was higher than 36%, you're wasting resources. So yeah, do an evaluation on does this one matter or not, that's important. But instead of trying to find every piece of equipment with every possible vulnerability, start with understanding what the exploitation of it would look like. What does the behavior in the environment look like? Can I monitor for somebody taking advantage of a Ripple 20 style of attack, whether or not I know that that piece of equipment has it? Then kind of from there go out. And if you want to go to things like vulnerabilities, then that's absolutely fine. But if you start with trying to run down every vulnerability in your environment, you'll never finish. And you will constantly miss people taking advantage of them, trying to think and hope that the patching is actually going to resolve it. So again, not anti-patch. I just don't think patching has the same efficacy in ICS security as it does in IT security.
Yeah, we always put as much time and effort, and maybe even more, on describing what the potential impact could be, when we send out a patch, like, so that people can make that call, right? Look, this is why and how you should be worried about this. If this is being used in this kind of a service, or if you don't have these other layers of protection, then this is something that you should be concerned about. If you do, don't worry about it. Okay, so I think that's a good point. And that plays into the safety. Again, like what I was saying earlier, you do the same thing with safety, right? You got to look at the particular use case to decide whether something needs to be addressed or not.
Yep, absolutely.
So I'm going to partially answer the next question that we have here as we move forward, and we can get to conclusion. But we'll answer any questions that were submitted fully offline also following the webinar. So the question comes in is, are OT solution providers, whether an internal resource of a plant or an external subcontractor, requiring equipment that has been evaluated for cybersecurity risk, or ideally certified as embedded and enabled for cybersecurity? For example, there are some hardware vendors who have gotten their products reviewed and audited as secure to the international standard of IEC 62443. And this is about becoming more aware of exercising ISA's, CSA component approach to certification. So I'm going to answer that partially. So certainly those are, from an Emerson perspective, we're road mapping, and we have products that are 62443 certified, as well as working on the development teams and their certifications also. So, but I'll ask Peter and Robert any quick comments on there before we move to concluding.
No, frankly, I'll be interested to hear what Rob has to say on how he values the relative efficacy of these standards and approval. I mean, we do them, as you said, Mike, because our customers demand them, frankly. I mean, we think they're a good thing, but also, the customers frequently, any more specs come in and they want to see that. And I can see why, because they're looking for something they can use as a tangible metric around this. And And the one thing I would say, at least with like 62443, is it's much more than just the test of did you pass a certain set of tests. With the secure development lifecycle parts and everything, it's do you care about cybersecurity, and are you thinking about it during the whole development process as you're building this product? So, arguably that might be more important than whether or not you pass test X, Y, or Z, is that whole part of it around the, are you culturally set up to be thinking about cybersecurity when you build a product?
And I think that's a great way to frame it. And kind of in the closing thought in general, tying it back to the digital transformation story, there are a lot of standards in play now, 62443, NERC-CIB, the bunch of them out there. They're going to become more numerous as we become more hyper-connected, and governments and others want to send assurances back. I agree with Peter that the do you care enough to be thinking about this is the measure anyways. But the short answer, to be perfectly candid with the audience, is if you are not an informed participant, the standard or framework's not going to help you. And I've seen too many people with like an RFP staple 62443 or NERC-CIB or something else to it and go, you need to comply with this. Cool, what are you trying to accomplish? I don't know, comply with that. And I don't care if your vendor does or doesn't comply with it, you're still screwed at that point. Go become an informed participant. Go figure out what risk you're trying to solve for, especially in this hyper-connected world. And then you can say, look, these controls out of 62443 matter a lot to us, or these controls out of NIST cybersecurity framework matter a lot to us. What are you doing for those? And now the answers matter.
Thanks, Robert. Thanks, Peter. We've heard a lot of discussion today about the digital transformation, how to digitally transform and how to limit security concerns. I believe the three takeaways that I'm going to leave you with are digital transformation is how business can gain efficiency and positively impact operational KPIs. The number two, transformation can be accomplished in a secure manner through people, process, and technology changes that upskill workforces, gain efficiency in operations, and implement technology with intentional purpose and design. And number three, working with the right partners like Emerson and Dragos are essential to building success criteria and executing securely. Thank you, Peter and Robert, for this engaging conversation and your time. I think, Amelia, you have a few wrap-up items for our participants.
Yes, thank you. And on behalf of today's presenters, thank you for attending this webinar. We hope you found it valuable and look forward to hearing from you through our survey. If you have a second to submit a few questions, we will definitely approach them offline and respond to you. If we didn't get to you today, we'll be sure to follow up. And if you want to learn more about the topic, download the resources on the resource link or request a demo or to speak to one of our speakers today. Thanks again. This concludes our event.
Okay, Peter and Robert, we should be